everybody. Happy hump day. Welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's deputy news editor, Sophie Bateman. Morning, Sophie.
Morning, Susie. How's it going?
This is Sophie's first time on the show, everyone, so be kind to her. She is living near the Northern Line, so if we get some rumbling in the background, it's not early morning indigestion, it is just Now, before we kick off, I want to remind you we're starting a new feature on this show. We want to hear from you. Email me with your thoughts, suggestions, questions we didn't answer, abuse, whatever's on your mind. I know lots of people see this after we finish the live, thousands more listen on podcasts, so get in touch, email me on susie.boniface@mirror.co.uk and we'll read out the best, all the more thought-provoking ones on air. We've got our first one later on, so stay tuned for that. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions, those of you who are with us right now, those of you listening later on podcast, you just have to regret your decision not to buy a personal wind machine like me. So, what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the arrest of a boy aged just 14 over the murder of an 80-year-old man in Leicester. Bim Coley was walking his dog when he was apparently set upon by a group of teenagers. More on that in the paper. But I want to take us first to page 6, where there's a story which will be setting the news agenda, I suspect, for the next week or two. Keir Starmer has let it be known that he will allow MPs a vote in Parliament on the controversial decision to means test the £300 winter fuel payment, which will mean that only the very poorest pensioners get it. Now, Sophie, can you take us through this a bit? What's the word? I'm trying to struggle now. How important is this vote going to be? How crucial, I suppose, to his authority?
I mean, this is going to be one of the first real tests of Keir Starmer's leadership, is essentially, can he get MPs to vote on what's become a very unpopular piece of legislation? It's come in for a huge amount of open criticism from Labour MPs already. There's already been Rachel Maskell, the MP for York Central, has already come out and said she won't be voting for it. And it sort of remains to be seen how many others are going to follow suit. They're going to be debating that plan in the Commons before they vote next Tuesday. And so I suppose it will come down to how harshly Starmer sort of wants to draw a line in the sand and say, you know, it's get in line, even though this sort of legislation seems incredibly sort of anti-Labour, you might say. It's all about means testing people on benefits and essentially making life harder and more expensive for the elderly, which is a tough sell for anyone, but particularly for a new government that's just come off the back of 12 years of Tory austerity, trying to make a name for themselves as a more sort of empathetic and socially minded government. And so to have to kind of immediately push something like this through is going to be pretty tough.
And obviously there's a lot of wealthier pensioners who got this payment and probably didn't need it and are probably a bit cross that they're not having it now. But it does seem that, this is also something that's being set at such a level, it's going to affect a lot of pensioners who are less well off, but just perhaps also on housing benefit. And like you say, it's a really tough thing to do. Now, what do you think, everybody? Have you been affected by the winter fuel payment decision? What do you think your MP should do about this? How should they vote on it? Because there's almost certainly going to be some kind of rebellion. Now, it's a risky strategy for Keir Starmer to say, well, you can have a vote on it then. But perhaps it's necessary to quell sort of the problems in his own party, because I think about half a dozen backbenchers have already spoken out about it. But, it's a parliamentary strategy too, because the Tories and Lib Dems were tabling their own attacks on this, so it kind of meant that the government had to have a vote of some sort in order to sort of stymie that. It was always going to be discussed one way or the other. You've got to lance the boil. But the question is really, I suppose, whether Starmer's going to whip his party to back this measure, whether they like it or not. And I suspect from what we saw, from those suspensions in the very first days of the government, when there were people who voted to scrap the two-child benefit cap, which went against party lines, he suspended, I think, 7 MPs for 6 months. Really harsh. That's exactly what he'll do again, won't he? I mean, what do you think? Do you think it'll be a free vote, or do you think he's going to be, asserting his authority again?
I think he will be asserting that authority very much doing the sort of, it's my party now and you get in line or you get out, essentially. And Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has sort of shut down any discussion that she might sort of reverse this or she might not go through with it. She's basically saying, this is tough, but we have to do it for the economy. And that's very much sort of the playbook for Labour going into what might be another quite tough winter for Brits is essentially we have to force through a bunch of these really unpopular economic strategies now so that we can benefit. They return again and again to that £22 billion black hole that they've inherited from the Tories. I do think at some point the public is going to tire of hearing that phrase and say, well, it's all very well, but you can't keep looking back. At some point you do have to own the decisions that you're making now that you're in government. But I would absolutely expect any Labour MPs who might think about not voting for this will have to weigh up very carefully about whether they can risk, losing the whip and, being suspended for 6 months, as we saw with that two-child benefit cap in July.
Yeah, because there's a lot of, impacts from perhaps losing a whip. You can still be a member of the party and you can still vote alongside the party, but you lose a lot of party support from government. You don't allowed to sort of necessarily speak publicly sometimes at things like Labour conference. So it sort of affects the other campaigns and so on that you might be working on. What do you think, everybody? Do you think this is something that your MP should be rebelling on? Do you think it's something that MPs can just afford to let slide because there's going to be other bigger, more important things to deal with later on? Do you think it's a necessary cut? Has Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves done the right thing? Can pensioners easily afford this? Or why not? Why didn't they? Is what I don't understand. Why didn't they just say, we're going to be doing this, but in 2 years' time when the costs come down? Not right now. It's going to happen. Prepare yourselves, but it's not there forever. Paul, Lotion on His Skin, says, why not look back? The Tories blamed Labour for 14 years. It does happen. I think the fact the Tories did that for 14 years and now Labour's doing it too is that's really wearing on people. I think when Sophie said that people are going to get fed up with it, I think they already are in a lot of cases because they're cute to that strategy. It doesn't work in the same way anymore. Wes says, where there's blame, there's a claim. Thanks, Wes. Now, so it's the Testis Authority. We've got people who've already criticised this move. And the government is firm, saying it's not going to U-turn. It's concentrating instead on trying to give some other forms of support to the poorest pensioners. But the scale of rebellion is pretty unclear. We don't know how big it's going to be. But let's be honest, Sophie, that there is going to be a rebellion against him of some sort, isn't there?
Oh, 100%. It'll just be a matter of each MP sort of weighing up the cost, as you said earlier, of what losing the whip can cost you for months at a time and whether or not they can kind of face up to their constituents knowing who will know which way, they voted on this.
Yeah, it's one of those things that every MP will be making a personal decision, but if he whips them, they're not allowed to make personal decisions. And this is what it comes down to as well. I mean, so a lot of those MPs might be deciding the fact, look, if you've got 412 people in your party, your vote's going to get through. If I object to it, it's not going to stop the law coming through, but it is perhaps going to work well for me and my constituency. It's going to mean I can sleep at night. It's going to be I can take a moral stance. That's going to happen throughout a parliament when you've got a big majority like this. So something he's going to have to weigh up. Now, before we head on to the main story of the day, let's try this new idea where you get some stuff off your chest, everybody. Now, after Monday's show, Richard from Redditch emailed pointing out a way that some of our problems might be solved. Now, whether you're Tory or Labour, we've all been told there's no money, taxes have risen. It may have to rise a bit more. Everyone's moaning about it. Richard says this is a very medieval, clunky way of doing things, taxing cigarettes to cure cancer, for example, which would make more sense to have a micro tax on transactions, what was known as the Robin Hood tax when it was first suggested during times of austerity. Now, Richard says, for example, if the average consumer spend is about £200 a day, and people are paying perhaps 0.25% on a transaction, be it eBay purchases, you're going to the coffee shop, whatever you've had to, the monthly spend, perhaps you can spread it out across a day, a new house, whatever, that would generate from each person a comparatively small 50p a day or maybe 182 quid a year. And that across the population, that's more than £1 billion. That's a lot of money. But it's only £1 billion to a government that deals in lots of billions of pounds. It's enticing because it's clean and simple and progressive, isn't it, Sophie? It's one of those things where we all think, well, I only spent £5 yesterday. I don't mind paying 0.25% in tax. And it is progressive because the big people who spend lots get more. The little people who spend less, like little old ladies who hoard their pension money under the mattress, they don't have to get taxed as much. Except, Sophie, can you ever think of a tax that hasn't increased? No, exactly. They all go up. And I'm not sure that I would trust any government with a 0.25% transaction tax making $1 billion to not think, well, I could make $4 billion if I make that 1%, and just ratcheting it up and up and up. And also, what happens when the City of London, which at the moment it's the financial trade in that is worth about 8% of the British GDP, about 12% of our tax receipts. When you're moving £1 million before lunch, one direction, and £1 million after lunch back again, and you're paying tax both times, twice in a day, I think you're going to find that London just moves somewhere else. I don't think that any government is going to say that's a good idea. It's an enticing idea. It is interesting, but you've got to bear in mind what happened when Robin Hood actually did start taxing people a small amount of their wealth when they went through down his road, and they started cutting down Sherwood Forest, Richard, and there's not much of it left anymore. So nice idea, but I don't think it's necessarily going to work. But one that we can all bear in mind, and it wasn't being discussed in the news agenda. So there we are, we've done it. So get back in touch if you've got any thoughts, ideas, things we haven't discussed, things you think people should be thinking about. If you've got an objection to my objection to the Robin Hood tax, whatever, get in touch, susie.boniface@mirror.co.uk. While you're at it, see if you can think of a name for this new slot. We can't call it What Does the Fox Say, because I think there'll be some copyright issues on that one. But who knows? Now, on to the main story of the day, and the public inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire will report back after 7 years. We've already had part 1, which was about how things went wrong and what happened on the night. We're now talking about why 72 people had to die in that tower block in West London in 2017 and who's responsible for it. Now, on Monday's show, we discussed a relative who was talking about the need for prosecutions, Sophie, and there's been survivors across the media since sort of repeating the same line. And there is a desperate need to see properly, people held to account, isn't there?
Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of sort of trepidation and skepticism over whether this report and what recommendations it might lay out will actually result in any kind of meaningful, tangible changes. They pointed out the government is not legally required to follow any of the recommendations that might come out. And a lot of Grenfell campaigners have sort of raised the concern that we might see another, Windrush or the post office scandal in which victims are very much still kind of fighting for justice today, despite having gone through these massive public inquiries. So I think there is an element of, yes, there will be an element of sort of catharsis today, as I think there always will be whenever Grenfell is sort of brought back to public attention, in the sense that those 72 people who died still have not really been fully laid to rest until there's sort of a definitive answer. I mean, this was such a sort of horrifying image that I think has haunted people in this country and around the world. Certainly, I wasn't living here when it happened, but I was working as a journalist at the time, and, we were sort of watching this absolutely horrifying live footage of this tower block just engulfed in flames, and knowing that there were still so many people trapped inside. That's a really difficult thing to dislodge from kind of cultural memory.
And there are tower blocks like that around the world, aren't there? That cladding is on tower blocks all across the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. I know several people who are really struggling to sort of sell their flats because the buildings are using this archaic kind of cladding. No one wants to go near it. No one wants to give them a mortgage. And I mean, it's certainly top of my mind. If I was ever considering, living in a tower block, or if I'm visiting someone who lives in a tower block, it's very hard for me to kind of be on a top floor of a building, regardless of whatever cladding it is using, and not have that image of Grenfell Tower just pop into my mind a little bit. And I think it's just such a sort of haunting thing to have happened. And there's also the other side of the coin, which is that regardless of what gets done, this is still kind of drawing a line under addressing that enormous loss and that enormous trauma, going some way to sort of not heal, because this sort of thing I don't think can ever really be considered healed, but sort of making sure that we do not have another Grenfell. I think campaigners and people who have sort of dedicated their lives to fighting for justice after that tragedy are sort of split, and probably are feeling, kind of holding two things in their mind at once, which is a sort of skepticism of any sort of change that might come about, but also just a sense of, well, this is still, regardless of what happens, a major step today.
Yeah, it's a big thing to have finally finished the inquiry, but 7 years is a damn long time. And there's been an awful lot, of course, lawyers and everything else involved that have helped drag it out. Now, what do you think, everybody? What would you like to see happen as a result of the inquiry? Would you like to see the government perhaps speed up what's going to be happening next with police charges and so on? And we don't know what's in the report. We don't get it until 11 o'clock this morning. It's likely one of the things it's going to reference don't even know what this person's name is, but they've got a avatar that says Ministry of Truth on it, so make your own judgments, people. It's curious as to whether people will be named and their role identified or left so dilute as to be useless. Quell Panama on Twitter says it's very unlikely there'll be any charges because there was double that number of people. 144 died at Aberfan and no one's ever held to account for that, although of course it was a long time ago. One of the things that the report should be hopefully referencing, hopefully its recommendations, is an offline meeting which was held between Kensington Borough Council and the firm which won the lowest bid for refurbishing the Grenfell Tower block, called Ryden. And this was evidence that was heard at the inquiry. And at this offline meeting, they agreed somehow to cut the cost of that refurbishment by a further £800,000, which meant putting cheaper and more combustible cladding on that tower. And that's one of the critical and most devastating decisions. Saving money literally costs lives, and it was during austerity and because of austerity. And also because the people in that tower block were not considered terribly important to Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council, that this all happened. So the criminal charges being looked at include things like gross negligence manslaughter, misconduct of public office, perversion of course of justice, fraud, health and safety offences. But this is the line that's quite astonishing to me, Sophie, and to the campaigners, I think, is that it's going to be another year after this before the police have completed their investigation, which has already been going, that'll be 8 years, right? Because they started on day one. And it's another year after that before the Crown Prosecution Service decides whether to bring charges. How exactly does it take another 2 years, which would be 9 years after those crimes, if there were any, were committed, to decide whether those investigations have produced enough? They've been at it for a decade. How can you, if you've got any evidence after a decade, you prosecute, don't you?
You would think so. I think it's very hard for certainly me to understand, for you to understand how, children who might have been living in Grenfell at the time will be adults by the time any charges are brought, if there are any charges. It just seems like, and I think the thing that's really difficult about that, the sort of incongruence of the fact that everyone saw this tower block in flames for an entire night and knows exactly, how many people were killed, and to still just be sitting here, almost a decade after it happened with sort of no action taken, I think is a really hard thing to sit with.
Yeah. Now, Richard says it seems that another outlier, Italy, has had the same self-regulated approach to fire safety and incidents like ours. We're going to need more high-rises in the near future, and we should take a page out of Germany and Sweden's book with that government-enforced building controls. Now, it's one of the things, what do you think, everybody? Do you think, like Sophie said, it was so obvious to all of us when you saw a tower block going up like a Roman candle that the cladding that was on the outside shouldn't have been on the outside? That just needs to be the fact. But it's still on about 2,300 buildings around the country because it's very difficult to get it down and get it replaced. Wes says a decade on, public money is not going to the people as compensation. It does seem a bit that when you have these public inquiries, Sophie, part of the reason for doing it is to delay and just say, well, all the punishment, we're going to leave that, so far down the road that no one will care anymore by the time we get to infected blood, post office, everything. We must have a better way of doing public inquiries, can't we? Other nations do it quicker than this. Yeah, well, I do wonder if we need a sort of Mr. Bates versus the post office type kind of Netflix series, maybe, to sort of reinvigorate people, because that certainly seemed to coincide with more action being taken on that particular scandal. So I do wonder if, does it take, a successful TV show with a famous actor in it to sort of bring these things back to public attention and see some action actually be taken? Yeah, tell me about it. Speaking of someone who's written about nuclear test veterans for 20 years.
Exactly. Better than most. Yeah.
40 years. We do have a documentary coming out though in a couple of months, so fingers crossed. Lotion on its skin says, to compare, the contaminated blood scandal hasn't been compensated. They've had some interim payments, Paul, but they haven't had the full and final ones, and the interim ones haven't exactly been welcomed in some cases. So one can only hope, really, that Starmer's government speeds up the decision processes a bit. And it will be Angela Rayner that responds later on today as Housing Minister to the report recommendations. Now, half the recommendations from the first report were not accepted by the Tories, and they didn't enact them. They included things like new national guidelines on evacuations, requiring owners of blocks like this to share floor pans with rescue services. Quite cheap stuff. You thought quite reasonable as well, but just rejected out of hand. One of the things that was recommended in the first report was a personal evacuation plan for disabled residents, because there were lots of people stranded in that tower in social housing who weren't able to get out because of their disabilities. And that is something which Labour has said they are going to do, and that is going to happen. Do you think there's any chance, Sophie, though, that Labour's going to act on everything that the Tories didn't? I know we've been talking, haven't we, about how there's no money and that he's being very tough and ruthless and all the rest of it. This is the kind of thing where Labour, surely there is no possible way politically that he cannot act on every single thing the people of Grenfell want done.
Oh, absolutely. Mind you, in terms of sort of differentiating themselves from the Tories and drawing a line between them and the last government, and also being seen to take really strong action on issues that are incredibly of extreme kind of public interest. We were just talking about, the winter tax, cutting winter fuel payments for, elderly people who aren't very well off, and they're prepared to do that. So it does sort of seem that maybe they're not as, I don't know.
Not as Labour as we thought they were.
Willing to do these quite like Tory-ish things. And not seem all that ashamed about it. However, I do think the idea that Labour would leave the idea on the table that they're willing to risk another Grenfell happening, that they're willing to have something like that happen on their watch, it seems pretty unlikely that they would want to leave the public with that impression. So I do think they will be making a big show of, really meeting the terms of whatever these recommendations are laid out in the report.
Oh, there she is. Yeah, sorry, you stopped briefly there. You're
sorry, a train literally was going past, so it might have disrupted the Wi-Fi.
That isn't your fault. It's one of those things, isn't it, that this is such a Tory scandal. The building was refurbished under the Tories. The cutbacks that led to the fire happened under the Tories. The local council had 12 people in its building control department, went down to 8 because of austerity. The inspector had like 130 different projects to keep an eye on, as well as Grenfell. All this kind of stuff. It's such a, and then the first report, the recommendations weren't acted on so long. It's such a Tory scandal that you think it would just be good, just for cynical political reasons, for Labour to say, do you know what? We've solved that. We've done this, and this, and it won't happen again. And
exactly.
Some of it is really cheap and it should be happening, but whether there's compensation or not.
Well, yeah, it seems like it would be an easy win, as far as
the thing with compensation is that would come from the taxpayer, and it's not the taxpayer that's at fault.
No.
It's the people in question. It's the people who made those decisions, and it's the business that decided to put that stuff on the outside of a tower block. It's as flat as that. But of course, if you want to go and penalise businesses, they just go into receivership, and that's the end of that. So we'll have to wait and see what Angela Rayner says later on, won't we? But stay tuned to your Mirror media outlet channels, and you will find some of the answers hopefully later on today. Right, thank you for that, Sophie. Now, we have managed to find some good news in the world for you, and here it is. That's what I need for my new feature. I need a little ident. It says, da, 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 this is what we're doing. Oh, we'll come up with that. Anyway, now, when Jane Carpenter's son, James, died 2 years ago from a brain tumour at the age of just 22, she was inspired to spread the joy that he had as a budding architect when he had been using Lego to take his mind off his tumour. Now, she set up a Lego amnesty for cancer patients to share their sets with each other. And she now gets cash donations to help her buy new ones. And she has handed out, get this, more than 700 sets of Lego to people with cancer to help them, just as it did her son, James. It takes their minds off things for a bit and gives them some other stuff to do. Now, Sophie, is this proof that if you give people the right building blocks, whether it's winter fuel payments, functioning building control, whatever it might be, they can all do something good with it if they just get the right things to start with?
Oh, you've tied it all together in an impeccable way there.
Jeez.
I didn't see it coming, but you said it all out and now.
I can't do it every day, but I do.
Extremely topical choice. Yeah, I think it shows that, and also shows that everyone loves Lego. It is a universal fact.
Yep, everyone enjoys it. No matter what age you are, you can create something fun and exciting and then take it all down and start again, and nobody's burnt to death. It's fantastic. Right, thank you very much, Sophie, for taking through all this. Thank you, Richard, for your thought earlier on. Thank you, everyone else, for taking part. If you want to tell us some of your thoughts to be featured in next Monday's show, email me, susie.boniface@mirror.co.uk. If you're listening on podcast, please leave us a review so other people can find us. And until next Monday, everybody, we'll see you then. But until then, stay safe, take care, tatty bye.